Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Tonight, I've got 3 true horror stories based on real accounts, and I think you're really going to enjoy these. If you do, make sure to drop a like on the video and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing that. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. I share stories like this all the time. Only about 4.4% of viewers who watch these videos are actually subscribed. If you enjoy the stories and want to support the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps a lot and keeps new content coming your way. Alright, if you're ready, let's dive straight into tonight's chilling tales. I was on my way home one evening in the spring of 2015. I had retired a few years prior from the Arizona Highway Patrol, but every once in a while, I would still run some occasional night shifts, mostly as a favor to a friend in the department who couldn't cover a shift. That night, it was me filling in, driving along a stretch of Route 66 just outside of Kingman. I had driven this road hundreds of times over my career, and I knew every dip, every turn, every patch where the asphalt had crumbled over the years. The desert was quiet at night, and even though it could be eerie, I had never felt truly unsafe until that evening. It started like any other night. The sun had set hours ago, and the headlights of my cruiser cut through the darkness. There was almost no traffic. Occasionally, I'd pass a trucker or another late-night driver, but mostly it was just me and the road. About 30 miles outside of Kingman, near a curve that led past an old abandoned gas station, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They were moving faster than they should have been, weaving slightly. I made a mental note, but kept driving. Then, the vehicle suddenly braked hard, almost hitting the guardrail, and I saw the blinding flash of its brake lights. I pulled over instinctively, turned on my lights, and waited for the car to slow down and stop. When it finally pulled over, I saw it was a late-model sedan, a dark gray color. It didn't have a license plate, which immediately raised my concern. I stepped out of my cruiser, flashlight in hand, and walked toward the driver's window. The man behind the wheel looked calm, maybe too calm. He was middle-aged, average build, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I asked him for his license and registration, the usual protocol, but his response immediately set off alarms in my mind. "Officer, I'm sorry. I don't have them on me," he said, his voice quiet but steady. I noticed his hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel, which seemed to contradict his calm tone. I asked him again, and he just repeated himself. At that point, I knew I had to run his plates, or in this case, figure out who he was without them. I asked him to step out of the vehicle, which he did without resistance, but he kept staring straight ahead as if he was looking past me. I asked him why he was driving so fast and erratically, and he said he didn't know what I meant. That's when I started to notice something else. He knew things about me, little details I hadn't mentioned to anyone. The fact that I had been born in Kingman, the route I had taken that day, even where I had stopped for lunch. At first, I thought maybe it was just luck, small talk connecting the dots. But the more he spoke, the more he mentioned things that no random driver should have known. I told him he needed to come with me to the station until we figured things out. He agreed without protest. We got back in our vehicles, and I followed him a safe distance, turning on my cruiser's lights for visibility. That's when things became even stranger. Every road he took, he seemed to anticipate my moves. If I tried to pull alongside him or box him in, he would slow down or speed up slightly, always keeping just enough distance. There was a precision to it that unsettled me. When we reached a stretch of road that ran parallel to a dry riverbed, I decided I couldn't risk him getting away or causing an accident. I called for backup. While waiting, I tried to engage him in conversation, asking why he didn't have a license, why the car didn't have plates. He answered vaguely, deflecting questions with small, almost cryptic remarks. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I've been waiting for someone like you," he said. It was so matter-of-fact, so calm, that it made the hairs on my neck stand up. I asked him what he meant, and he smiled faintly, just enough to unsettle me. "I've been out here a long time. I've seen everything, and I've been waiting for someone who could catch me just once." Backup arrived shortly after that. We tried to take control of the situation, but the man seemed to anticipate every move, every attempt to pull him over again. He didn't resist, but he didn't act naturally either. It was like he had rehearsed every possible scenario. Eventually, the backup officer suggested that we call in state police, and while waiting for them, something unexplainable happened. The man simply vanished. One moment he was there, sitting in his sedan, hands on the wheel, eyes forward, and the next, the car was empty. The doors were locked, nothing on the seats, and the keys were gone. We searched the area for hours, combing the nearby desert, the dry riverbed, even the abandoned gas station. There was no sign of him anywhere. No footprints, no tracks, nothing. I filed the report, of course, but nothing ever came of it. No missing persons reports matched his description. The vehicle was never recovered. I've driven that stretch of Route 66 dozens of times since then, but I never saw that car again, and I never saw the man. I never spoke about it publicly, mostly because people wouldn't believe me. Some nights, when I drive alone, I can't help thinking about the calm way he spoke, about the small details he knew about me, about how he seemed to be waiting for someone like me. Even now, I don't know if he was a criminal, a stalker, or something else entirely. All I know is that he wasn't just a man driving a car. He was aware of me in a way that didn't make sense, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be truly watched. The idea that someone or something could know your movements, your history, your habits, without any logical explanation, is the kind of thing that stays with you forever. Years later, I still avoid that stretch of road whenever possible. I stick to the main highways, the roads that are busy and monitored. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the highway is empty and the desert stretches on endlessly, I swear I can see headlights in the distance, moving fast, weaving slightly, just like that night. And I always wonder, is he still out there, waiting for someone else to notice, waiting for the next person to drive too slowly or too quickly along that road? I've told myself 100 times that it was just a man, a clever driver, someone who got away. But there's a part of me, a part one can't ignore, that knows it wasn't ordinary. And it isn't just the memory that haunts me. It's the realization that the desert has ways of hiding people, keeping them unnoticed, letting them exist in the spaces between the towns and the roads. That night, I got a glimpse of one of those spaces, and I never forgot it. I had just moved to Prescott in early 2018. I wasn't from Arizona originally. I grew up in Ohio, but I wanted a slower pace, somewhere small and quiet. Prescott seemed perfect. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where the streets had names people recognized, and the hills in the distance made it feel enclosed in a way that was comforting. I found a job working the night shift at a diner on the edge of town, just off the main road that led through the historic district. It was one of those places that had been around forever. The building was old, the counter scratched in places, and there were a few regulars who came in every night without fail. The first week was routine. I got to know the coffee machines, the way the fryers ran, the names and habits of the regulars. There was an older man named Carl who came in every night at exactly 10:15, ordered black coffee and a slice of cherry pie. There was a woman named Linda who came in on weekends, always ordering scrambled eggs and bacon. I figured I'd learn everyone eventually. I had no reason to suspect anything unusual. Prescott seemed quiet, safe. Then, about 3 weeks in, I started noticing something strange. It began small. A customer would come in, someone I didn't recognize, sit at a booth, and I'd look away for a moment. When I looked back, they would be gone. Not just leaving the diner, but gone as if they had never been there. I asked the night cook about it, but he just shrugged and said people came and went. The place was old, he said. Memories can play tricks on you. I nodded, but it didn't feel right. A few nights later, I was closing up. It was around 2 a.m., and the diner was empty except for me and a man sitting at the counter. I didn't recognize him, which wasn't unusual at that hour. He didn't order anything. He just sat there, staring down at the counter. I asked if he wanted coffee, and he shook his head, never looking up. I went about cleaning the tables and washing dishes. When I glanced back after a few minutes, the man was gone. I double-checked the rest of the diner, the bathroom, the kitchen, but there was no one there. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was tired, overworked, seeing things that weren't real. But then I started to notice a pattern. Names and faces that I didn't recognize at first, but that seemed oddly familiar when I checked the town records. They were people who had gone missing over the last few decades. One night, I saw a man sitting in the same booth Carl usually took. But when I looked closer, it wasn't Carl. It was a man in his 20s, and I realized he had gone missing in 1998. I didn't say anything at the time, just kept my distance, and when I blinked, he was gone. It got worse. Over the next few months, the diner became a place where I noticed that the boundaries between time and reality seemed to thin. I would see women with outdated clothes, people who looked as though they had stepped out of photographs from old newspaper clippings. Every time I tried to point it out or discuss it with anyone, it felt impossible. They were gone by the time anyone else looked. I started keeping notes, writing down the times, the faces, the details I could remember. I began to recognize the pattern. They all matched missing persons reports, and some had been missing for decades. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself that maybe small towns keep stories alive, that the history of Prescott lingered in the people who lived there. But the evidence kept piling up. One night, I stayed late, determined to document what was happening. Around midnight, I noticed a man at the far booth, hunched over a cup of coffee, his hands folded. I didn't recognize him, but something about the way he held himself made my stomach tighten. I went to check the files. The name matched someone who had disappeared in 1977, a man named George Trenton. His disappearance had never been solved. I watched him for hours. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't leave. Around 3 in the morning, he stood up, and I realized he wasn't stepping toward the door. He was stepping into the wall. The air seemed to ripple around him, and within seconds, he was gone. I ran to the spot, touched the wall, felt nothing but the cold, painted wood. I started to panic, wondering if I was losing my mind. After that night, I began researching the diner's history. It had been operating since the 1950s, the same building. Over the decades, there had been reports of missing people, unexplained disappearances in Prescott, particularly along that stretch of road where the diner sat. The more I read, the more I realized that the diner wasn't just a business. It was somehow connected to the people who went missing. People would come in, sometimes for years, sometimes just for one night, and then vanish without explanation. I started noticing regulars who shouldn't have been there. Older women who looked like they had been in their 20s in photographs from the 1960s. Men who appeared unchanged despite decades passing. It was like the diner existed outside of time, a place where people who had disappeared could be seen, even if only fleetingly. It became a burden. I started taking nights off, but even when I wasn't there, I would drive past and see figures inside, sitting in booths, staring out at the empty parking lot. I knew them, though I had never met them, and they knew me, or seemed to. There was a presence in the diner that could not be explained by logic. I tried talking to the town authorities, but I could never find anyone who believed me. Everyone said the diner was just old, that I was seeing shadows or reflections. But I knew the truth. I saw it too clearly. I watched the missing, the forgotten, trapped in a place that shouldn't have existed that way. And over time, it started to wear on me. I stopped working there altogether after 6 months. I couldn't handle it anymore. I moved to a different town, far from Prescott, and tried to leave it behind. But the images didn't leave me. I was working as a caretaker for an old abandoned copper mine near Jerome, Arizona. The mine had been shut down for decades, officially closed since the late 1950s, and the town had mostly moved on. My job was simple on paper. Check the property regularly, make sure no one was trespassing, keep the buildings from collapsing entirely, and report any issues to the company that still technically owned the land. The mine itself had a long history. It had been one of the largest in the state at its peak, but after the closure, it became just another empty shell of rusted metal, broken beams, and tunnels that disappeared into darkness. I had been assigned the caretaker role for a few months before anything unusual happened. Most days were monotonous. I would check the old office building, the storage sheds, the equipment yard. The buildings were falling apart slowly. The roof leaked in places, and the walls were cracked, but I expected that. At night, the place was completely silent except for the occasional desert animal. I was used to working alone, and for the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. The first odd sign was subtle. I was doing my usual inspection of the main shaft area when I noticed footprints in the dust leading away from the office building toward the entrance of one of the tunnels. I knew I hadn't seen anyone else there that day. I checked the area thoroughly. No vehicles, no tracks from tires, just the footprints in the dust. At first, I thought maybe a hiker had wandered in. The area was technically off limits, but it wasn't hard to access. I chalked it up to trespassers and didn't think much of it. The next morning, I found more signs. Tools I had left in the office the night before were moved slightly, not in a way that seemed deliberate, but enough to make me notice. A flashlight I had put on the counter was on the floor. At this point, I started documenting everything, taking photos and notes. I told myself it was probably just kids exploring the mine, sneaking in despite the warnings. But as the days went on, the disturbances grew. One afternoon, I was checking the tunnel entrances with my flashlight and noticed markings on the walls. Scratches that looked like they had been made by metal claws or heavy tools. The scratches weren't random. They formed patterns, straight lines and shapes that didn't make sense but seemed intentional. I photographed them and sent them to the company, but they assumed it was vandalism. I asked around Jerome about recent reports of trespassing, but no one had seen anything unusual. The next night, I stayed later than usual, walking through the main shaft. I could feel the air change as I moved deeper into the tunnel system. It was heavy, almost like it resisted movement, but it wasn't wind or temperature. I turned a corner and saw a figure. At first, I thought it was a worker from town, maybe someone who had come in to explore. But as I got closer, I realized no one could be there. The figure was partially obscured, hunched over, wearing what looked like mining clothes from decades ago. There was no way anyone could have been wearing that. I froze. The figure didn't move at first. Then it raised its head slightly and seemed to study me. I wanted to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. After a few moments, the figure disappeared, not behind a wall or a corner, just vanished into the darkness as if it had never been there. I thought I was imagining things, but the scratches on the wall were new, fresher than before, and my flashlight beam caught them in a way it hadn't earlier. From that night on, things escalated. I started noticing that items I left in certain areas of the mine would be in different spots the next day. My boots were sometimes moved near tunnel entrances I hadn't even been near. My notes would be rearranged. Sometimes I would come back to the office to find the doors unlocked when I was certain I had locked them. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was forgetting things. Maybe animals were responsible. But the pattern didn't fit any natural explanation. One night, I was inspecting the deepest accessible tunnel. I had to climb over broken timbers and rocks, and it was exhausting work, but I needed to check it before the weekend. As I reached the far end, I found a room that seemed intact, almost preserved. It looked like a small office, maybe where the mine foreman had worked years ago. There were papers on a desk, a ledger, a helmet, all covered in dust. I moved closer, and the moment I touched the ledger, it opened on its own. Pages turned to a section I hadn't touched before. Names were listed, workers, obviously, but some names were familiar. Men who had gone missing over the years in Jerome, not officially connected to the mine, but missing all the same. I stepped back, heart racing, and realized the room hadn't been accessible when I checked it last. I had walked through this tunnel hundreds of times. There was no way it had appeared naturally. The feeling of being watched hit me hard. I turned, shined my flashlight down the tunnel, and saw a shadow move at the far end, retreating as I approached. I followed, but there was nothing. The air felt heavier, colder, though the desert outside was hot. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances became harder to ignore. I would see figures, sometimes more than one, dressed in old mining uniforms, hunched, moving slowly through the tunnels. I could hear the faintest sounds of tools clinking or boots scraping rock, though nothing was physically there when I checked. My equipment would fail inexplicably. Flashlights dying instantly, radios cutting out. My phone would show images I hadn't taken. Sometimes I would come back to my own living quarters near the mine and find messages scratched on walls or doors, in handwriting I didn't recognize, spelling out names, dates, or warnings. Then the strangest incident happened. I was inspecting the old shaft elevator, the wooden cage that had long since been deemed unsafe. I leaned in to check the cables, and I saw a figure inside, crouched low, wearing a helmet and dusty overalls. It looked up at me, and for the first time, I felt something other than fear. It was recognition. The figure stood slowly, walked out of the cage, and stopped just short of the light from my flashlight. I could see its face then, partially illuminated. It was a man, but not alive in the sense of living. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes dark and hollow, and his mouth set in a permanent line. He spoke softly, just a few words I barely caught. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. I didn't move. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't. Then, as I blinked, he was gone. Not walking away, not disappearing behind a wall, but gone entirely. I checked the elevator. Nothing. I touched the walls of the shaft, solid, unbroken. But the dust around the base of the elevator was disturbed, as if someone had just stepped out. I realized at that moment that I wasn't just dealing with trespassers or vandals. I was in a place where time didn't work the way it should. The mind was occupied, but not by the living. People who had died, people who had disappeared, were still there, in some form, lingering in the tunnels, interacting with the physical world in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I stayed longer after that night, determined to understand, to document. But the more I stayed, the more I noticed I was being watched and sometimes followed, even outside the tunnels. One evening, I left the mine around sunset. I was tired, emotionally drained. I walked back toward my cabin when I saw movement in the hills above the mine. Figures moving along the ridges, just silhouettes at first, but I recognized their stances, their helmets, the way they carried tools. They were the men I had seen in the tunnels. They didn't move toward me, but they didn't leave either. It was as if the mine itself had a claim on them, and now it was aware of me. After months of this, I finally decided I couldn't stay. I resigned. I sold my belongings, left Jerome, and moved to Tucson. But the memory didn't leave. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I dream I'm back in the tunnels, moving past rusted beams and broken timbers, trying to keep up with the figures that vanish just as I approach. When I close my eyes, I can still see the pale faces, hear the faint clinking of tools in the darkness. Years later, I drove back to the area near the mine. The land is fenced off now, posted with no trespassing signs. I didn't enter. I didn't want to. I stood on the dirt road, looked up at the hillside, and for a moment, I saw them moving in the shadows, still there, still waiting. I realized then that some places never let go of the people who belong to them. The mind still has its claim, and anyone who works there, anyone who enters, becomes part of it, whether they realize it or not. I've never gone near another abandoned mine since.